Hey, today I'm going to do a video that I have meant to do for quite a while. I just needed to sit down and compile my list. I'm going to talk about my ultimate favorite audiobooks. Now, to set this up a little bit, years ago, I would say 10 years ago or more, I kind of just assumed audiobooks were for people who either were not able to read or couldn't read. And how wrong I was. I know it's become a lot more popular now because of Audible. I'm not really sure when Audible kind of became really, really popular, but I feel like audiobooks are so much more popular now, and for good reason. They are awesome. And if you are someone who wants to read and just doesn't have a lot of time, audiobooks are a way that you can get a lot more reading done. So the very first book that kind of turned me on to audiobooks was kind of, I guess, like an honorable mention. One of my honorable mentions was Gary Sinise reading Of Mice and Men. He actually plays George in the movie version of Mice and Men. I found that book just so good. I was so into it that I decided to try some on my own. The first books that I ever tried on my own were none other than Harry Potter. The year Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows came out, I wanted to reread them all, but I was in school and working full time, so I needed to rely on audiobooks. I have only listened to the ones that's read by Jim Dale. I know that Stephen Fry does the UK version. I don't really know where I can access that, but Jim Dale does a fabulous job, and that is my for sure number one recommendation. I listen to them frequently when I'm going to bed. They're very cozy, comforting stories for me, but also he just does such a good job. He does so many voices. I think it was over 300 voices. And he just does such a good job at mimicking the voices that we know from the movies. I cannot recommend those enough. Now, moving to my second favorite audiobooks that I've ever listened to. It's two by the same author, Sherman Alexie. I did a standalone review of his book, You Don't Have to Say You Love Me. That came out last summer. And in that video, I mentioned how much I love him, and I love his story also, the Tales of a Part-Time Indian. And he has such a unique way of speaking. He mentions in the memoir, You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, that it's the sing-song voice of his tribe. I just love it. I think you can't get better than a memoir read by the author. And seriously, You Don't Have to Say You Love Me is so good. I mean, his voice cracks and he laughs, and it just makes you feel like you're listening to a real human telling you their real story, which it is. Obviously, it's a memoir. And then Tales of Part-Time Indian is the fictionalized version of his childhood. Both so good, and I cannot recommend them enough. Now, the rest of them are not in particular order. Those are just my top two. Along the lines of memoirs, Tina Fey, Lena Dunham, Amy Poehler, Mindy Kaling especially, is Everyone Hanging Out Without Me. They all have books, and I will link them all below. They all have books, and I think you cannot, again, get better than somebody telling their story, and it's their unique voice. They have their special delivery, but I would say Bossy Pants by Tina Fey is the best of that group that I mentioned, and they're so, so good, and I would highly recommend those. The story Wild by Cheryl Strayed. It was super popular a few years ago, a movie with Reese Witherspoon. I listened to it on audio, and actually Cheryl doesn't read it, someone else does, and her voice was just so perfect. I just loved it. So that one is also really, really excellent. I will say for a lot of those stories, a lot of popular stories, it's hard because if you listen to them and you have the wrong person reading, it can impact how you feel about the book. I have some examples of that. One I'll mention later. Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. Oh my God. So, so good. The story is wonderful, but his reading it, again, you get that accent. It's the way he says Volkswagen, which is so cool. I loved that one. That one was very, very good, and I didn't want that one to end. Silver Linings Playbook, this one's kind of a random one. Again, this was a movie and it was really, really popular. And the narrator of the story is quite unique. If you've seen the movie or if you've read the book, it's a quite unique story. And the guy who reads it does such a good job reading it in a unique way. That one had me like listening to every single word, and there were certain parts of it, especially the end, like the whole last part of it, I just didn't want it to end. He has such a good voice. One of my all-time favorites, another of my all-time favorites, I guess, is David Sedaris. I have read most of his books, like hard copies of their books, but I actually have When You Are Engulfed in Flames, Me Talk Pretty One Day, and then the newest one, the Diaries one, I have that one. I have not listened to that, but Me Talk Pretty One Day and When You Are Engulfed in Flames are so funny. The first story in Me Talk Pretty One Day is really funny, and he has a unique voice, and again, it's so much better hearing his story with his own voice. I would really recommend listening to him versus reading. Not that he's not funny in writing, but way funnier in person. I've actually gotten to meet him and hear him read a couple times, and it's just as funny in person. One that's a little bit like, I loved it so much, but I'm a little tentative to tell like lots of people to read it, is Kevin Smith's book, and it's called Tough, S-H-I-T, and it's like has a little like second name for it. He writes the story about kind of how he fell in love with movies. He calls them flicks all the time, and he sounds like so cool when he says it. If you know who Kevin Smith is and his movies, if you're familiar with any of that stuff, he's very like inappropriate and all this stuff, but he did such a good job. I listened to that audiobook twice actually, and he did such an excellent job making you feel as passionate for his story as he does. My one thing with that is that the very first chapter, or I don't know if it's like a preface or a chapter, he talks about like his conception. He does mention like kind of graphically how you become conceived, and when I first listened to it, I was like, man, this is gonna be a total bro book and I'm not gonna be into it at all. And I fell in love with it. So I will like warn you, if you don't want to listen to something like that, you could even just skip the first chapter. But he's really unique, but it's such a good story. And then my last of my favorites is an audiobook of poems. Taylor Mali is one of my favorite poets. I first saw him on Deaf Poetry like a million years ago. God, it had to have been like seriously like 15 years ago, which makes me feel really old, but I love him so much, and he has a couple different books, but the one that I like is Icarus Airlines, I believe is what it's called, and it's so good. And in it, he talks about the death of his first wife by suicide, and he just talks about all these different things, and he's a teacher, and they're so, so good. And I can't say, like, honestly, hearing poetry makes it more meaningful for me. So I have a few like honorable mentions, that books that I liked, but they're not like my ultimate favorite. So two of them are classic novels, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Scarlett Johansson reads that, and Anne of Green Gables, and Rachel McAdams reads that. I kind of think it's cool when you get to revisit some old classics that are read by people that you know, which makes them more familiar. So their voices sound familiar to you. It kind of makes the story more familiar, if that makes sense. Rachel McAdams did such a good job with Anne of Green Gables, and I actually listened to that one with a different narrator a couple years ago. It was actually the woman, I don't know her name, but it was the woman who played Ellis Gray on Grey's Anatomy, if you ever watched Grey's Anatomy. And she read it, and I got to chapter 8 and I was just kind of over it. I don't think she did a bad job, but it just wasn't that enthralling for me. Again, Anne of Green Gables is a like young adult story, so I'm not the target audience, but Rachel McAdams, just her voice felt like it was like a mom or my sister. It was like a comforting, cozy voice to listen to. That sounds really weird, but I loved it. and I just finished that one last week, but I would tell people to read it. And if you loved Anne of Green Gables and you want to like revisit something like that, I would get that one. I think that's maybe an Audible exclusive. Let's see. Another kind of like young kids one is the Series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. I love those. I love those stories so much. I can't wait till the HBO series comes back. But those are really good too, and ones that you could listen to in the car with your children as well, because sometimes it's a little bit of a crapshoot with what you're listening to. On the Tim Curry note, I also listened to A Christmas Carol by Tim Curry. Not by Tim Curry. It's by Charles Dickens, but Tim Curry reads a version of it, and I listen to that every year for Christmas or at Christmas time, and he does an excellent job with that. And then my last two kind of randoms, they're more like a chick lit kind of vibe. The Girl on the Train by Paula Hawkins was really, really good on audio, and 1+1 by Jojo Moyes was also really good. So if you're kind of more into that like fiction but kind of chick lit, those ones are really good, and I was super enthralled. Both of the narrators were really, really good, and that's what I will say is like the reader of the story really does impact whether you're gonna like the book or not. So that's a little bit difficult. So if you ever are looking for audiobooks, I would look up reviews first, because you will often, like, people will say, yes, Will Wheaton. I should have mentioned Will Wheaton in Ready Player One. That's definitely on my top as well. That's my addendum to this video. But a lot of people will say stuff like, Will Wheaton is so good, Ready Player One, awesome, awesome, awesome. And you'll see all these different reviews, and then you'll sometimes, like with You're the Lady in the Window, the reviews weren't very good. So for that one, I will read the hard copy. If you don't have Audible, they always run that promotion. I'm sure you guys have all heard this. They always run the promotion of like, you can sign up for your free 30 days and you get 2 free audiobooks, I believe. And you really can just sign up for free 30 days and then cancel. I love Audible. I only do every other month because I don't get through them enough. So I pay $14.99 every other month. If you don't want to do Audible, I also get audiobooks from my local library, which is super awesome. I don't know how available that is in everywhere, but like our library stocks most really popular books, and then obviously all the old time classics as well. So I know also my library is connected with Overdrive. Is that everywhere? I think that's everywhere. So you can get some audiobooks through there as well. But I love audiobooks. I love listening to them when I'm getting ready in the morning, when I cook in the evening. I love them all the time, and it really does help get through the massive to be read list that I know that most of us have. So with that, I'm going to end the video here. Hopefully this was helpful. I would like to hear people's suggestions of awesome audiobooks that you have listened to, any especially that I haven't listed here, although like I'd love to hear your opinions on audiobooks in general, or the ones that I've read. But if you have any that you really liked on audio, I would love to hear them because I'm obsessed. I'm currently listening to Food Freedom Forever by Melissa Hartwig, and I'm listening to another, like, what they described as like a cozy mystery. It's A Quiet Tale in the Country or something. I don't remember. I'll link all of this below, and I'll link what I'm currently reading as well. And thank you for watching, and I will talk to you again very soon. All right.